Hey everybody, KC here. So it was a couple of weeks ago, I was about halfway through reading my advanced copy of Robert B. Parker's Bye Bye Baby by Ace Atkins. I was about halfway through the book. I was loving it. And I saw a news item which said that this is actually going to be Ace Atkins' last contribution to the Spenser series. And I have to tell you, I kind of felt like I'd lost a friend. For 10 years now, 10 books, Ace Atkins has churned out a terrific Spenser novel, continuing a series that I loved, continuing a character that I loved. And I had come to count on the fact that when I read a Spenser novel that he wrote, that he was going to be able to capture Robert B. Parker's voice. He was going to be able to get that first-person narration absolutely right without seeming to imitate Parker, which is a really, I think, hard thing to do. But this is actually the 50th Spenser book, and it is Ace Atkins' 10th Spenser book, and he's decided to move in different directions. And so, including continuing, obviously, with the Quinn Colson series that he writes on his own. This guy's churning out 2 books a year. That's a lot. Anyway, as soon as I saw that, I said, well, I need to talk to Ace. And he's appeared here on the Morning Newsbeat a couple of times. I've interviewed him maybe a half dozen times over the years. I really like him. I enjoy his work. But I reached out and we did a little Zoom interview to talk a little bit about Bye Bye Baby. By the way, I'll put a link below on where you can get it. And but also to talk about the Spenser series and some of the creative challenges that came with copying somebody or following somebody who did such an extraordinary job. This is a terrific book. It was funny, as soon as I was done, I went back and reread his first Spenser novel, Lullaby. Hasn't missed a step. They've only continued to get better and better and better. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with author Ace Atkins. Ace Atkins, welcome to Morning Newsbeat.
Hey, great to see you, Kevin.
I'm so glad to have you back, although I have to say, I'm a little disappointed that we're talking here about your new Spenser novel, which is Bye Bye Baby. I'll hold it up. Available everywhere books are sold, but it's also your last Spenser novel. So my question is, what the hell are you thinking?
Well, you know, Kevin, I'm really happy to be talking to you because you've been here since the beginning. You were one of the first people to talk to me about writing Spenser, and I think maybe we even talked before I even finished Lullaby. So I appreciate all the support over the years. I think that it's just, you know, this is going to be this is the 50th Spenser novel. This is also the 10th Spenser novel that I have written. I think it's the time to, you know, step back and work on some more of my own projects. And, you know, the thing about it is, no matter what I do with these books and how long I write them, the truth of it is these are always Parker's books. And I'm just continuing his legacy. And it's a legacy that I love. I love the character. I love this world. But, you know, at some point I've got to get back and work on my own projects. But I will miss writing him a great deal. What a fun time to get into this world.
Yeah, I can't even imagine what it's like to turn out 2 books a year. I mean, that's got to be in some ways backbreaking.
It doesn't allow for a lot of vacations and a lot of downtime. You know, there's not a lot of days I can say I'm not feeling the muse. I mean, the muse has got to, you know, show up whether I like it or not. But it's been, you know, it's been enjoyable. But I think working on a book a year or so, and looking ahead in the future, I think that's going to be a little nicer. Will allow me to have a little bit more free time, a little bit more fun.
So did you name it Bye Bye Baby on purpose? Was there a, you were saying, that's it, folks?
I think it was I don't know if it was a conscious or subconscious thing, but I think it was certainly a little tip of the hat you know, so long. But it certainly makes sense in the Parker style and the feel. I think that, you know, that's what I'm always looking for in writing these books is what would Bob do and how would Bob tell the story? And that's really an added level of difficulty in writing the book, because when I sit down and I write, you know, a Quinn Colson book, or I'm writing, you know, one of my own novels, I'm writing the way that I would tell it. And I could decide to tell it in any way that I want to. I can tell it from the the end and go back to the beginning. I can shift characters as I see fit. I can tell from different point of views. But when writing Spenser, you're writing it as Spenser. And as writing as Spenser, you are writing in the voice of Robert B. Parker. And so that's really what I sought out to do from the beginning, is write these books so they had the feel and the style of Parker.
Yeah. I'm curious, as a writer, what have you learned from the experience of doing that, of stepping into someone's shoes? And I would say, as a reader, and I've read all 50 several times, in many cases a piece. I mean, I always thought when you did a really good job of capturing the voice without seeming to imitate the voice, which is, I think, a hard thing to do. But what have you learned as a writer from doing it?
Well, one of the people that really inspired me when I first started taking these books was a guy named John Gardner, who was an excellent thriller writer. Who was
He wrote the James Bond books, right?
He was handed a huge task, even though he's a very accomplished author and had published many books and critically acclaimed, to come in and write, to do Bond. And he managed to do it with the same confidence and feel of his own novels, but to pepper it in with the voice and the sound and the accuracy to those earlier books. So you didn't jump in from, it was mainly kind of a time shift, and not unlike what I've done with Spenser, which Spenser is Spenser as he was in the 70s and 80s, but he's just working now in 2022, and that's what Gardner did. So when I was asked to do that, to take on this task, I did not want to put my stamp on it. I wanted it just to have that feel of the original Spenser books.
And it is interesting. One of the things I noticed in the book, you make the point at one point that he's more facile with computers.
Sure.
He talks about Google. Things that, I don't even know if Parker would have done that. Yeah. But I think it's valuable. And, he makes the point. And he doesn't have a landline on his phone, on his desk anymore, which I thought was a really funny line.
Well, I think that if you're, that was the one thing that has always been tasked to me by the Parker family, is they really were sure that the one thing they didn't really mind changes that I would make or that kind of thing, but they just said, we got to keep it contemporary. And, they believe that the fan base enjoy these books annually because the stories were contemporary stories. And that's not necessarily what I wanted to do. I wanted from the beginning to write Spenser in the 70s. I wanted to write about Boston before, things changed and neighborhoods changed, and when Southie was still gritty and dirty, and I wanted to do all that stuff. But they really wanted to keep the books contemporary. So that was the one thing that I wanted to, that I had to keep consistent.
So yeah, it's an interesting challenge. You want to keep the books contemporary, keep the character as contemporary as possible,
right?
And yet not allow him to age, right? Which is like Michael Connolly. That's the issue he's dealing right now with Harry Bosch, which is he's like 75.
And really, the Connolly model is something I do in the Quinn Colson books. Is his life evolves, changes. He gets older. You start off with meeting him. He's still a man in his 20s that comes home from war, and now he's really a veteran sheriff at this point that's been around for years. And I like that. But Parker, this was kind of a sleight of hand trick, which is to do a contemporary story. But in doing so, what you mentioned earlier, you can't be the best private eye in Boston if you can't use Google.
Right.
You've got to admit, Spenser hasn't changed, but the world has changed around him. And so we have to kind of accept the modern world. Parker left this world without having to address some of those things. But as the stories continued on, we had to, Spenser had to be able to use databases and that kind of thing.
It was funny. I went back and reread Lullaby, which was your first one. And I think it's in chapter 1. He makes a comment about having fought Jersey Joe Walcott. Probably not a reference you would make today, 10 years later.
Well, I think at the time I didn't really know, This was a one-off deal. It was kind of a one-off deal, which is, let's see, we're going to do a Spenser book and have you do this, and let's see if the fans will accept it, and let's see how it goes. And so I didn't know if there was going to be another one. So I think I was still married to the world that Spenser was still the Spenser from the 70s. And as the series progressed, as I wrote it, I realized, oh, wow, these books are going to go on for many years and years after, when I stopped doing them. And so we need to come up with some alternatives. So yeah, I think the modern Spenser, the Spenser that I write about in Bye Bye Baby, did not fight Jersey Joe Walcott, and I don't think Henry Somoli fought Willie Pep. And you have to make those changes, but still keep the character the same.
It's also interesting. You've done, I think, especially the last two books, it seems to me, you've done a really interesting thing in terms of connecting them to current events, right? The last book, Someone to Watch Over Me, that had real connections to the Jeffrey Epstein case. I mean, echoes, you didn't copy it.
Oh, yeah,
And then there's clearly a character in Bye Bye Baby who bears more than a passing resemblance to AOC.
sure.
It was, again, I mean, clearly it's conscious because you're sitting down to do it. Was that an important thing in your mind to make it more timely, as opposed to, timeless is not the right word, but you know what I mean?
I think the mistake of any, in continuing a character like this or continuing a character like James Bond or whatever, it's really a heavier burden upon the author that's continuing the books is to come up with something really good for them to do. Because if I just wrote a Spenser book and, oh my God, there's a lawyer who's dead and he's in the, he's in the Boston Common and Spenser has to come out to investigate whatever. I don't know. I don't really care. Why are we doing these books anymore? What's the point? Just to keep the character alive, or are we doing what Parker did, which is social commentary? And I think that, again, going back to the connection with the continuation of the books and keeping it current and contemporary is to address contemporary stories. The Epstein case was just like so ripe for a Spenser novel, and to fictionalize that and play with that. And then I think that currently what's happening, in America with the rise of the white nationalist, and that's something Parker, really has written about in some ways before, going back to books like Rachel Wallace. And I think that's what one of the many things that separates Spenser from the massive amounts of hero-driven books that are out there is the social commentary. It's the humor. It goes back to Chandler's, idea of a moral man, walking down the dark alley. And that's, I think, in these times where decency, morality, common sense is really in short supply. I think that's really why these books matter more than ever these days. So I had to take it on. I think if Parker was still alive, he'd be writing about the same thing.
Well, and I'm guessing when you were writing the new one, Boston probably did not have a Black female mayor.
Yeah, right. And they did have a congresswoman in Ayanna Pressley, and so she's a little AOC, Ayanna Pressley, sticking those same things. And when you read about, what those women have to go through with it, it's not just an idea of getting a death threat. It's like, how many death threats are we getting a day? Is this, how many death threats are coming in? How many people just want to say the most vile, reprehensible things to me, and emails and letters and that kind of thing? And, at what point does a threshold come in where, it just was, I think it was an interesting case for Spenser to take on, and certainly very Spenserian, I guess you'd say. It certainly was something where Spenser really never talks about politics and his views on, how money should be spent and what is our role in, international politics, and that's not Spenser's job. But he also knows, what the right thing is to do, and he's never been a fan of bullies, and so I think it was the perfect story for him to tell.
Have you gone into it? I think one of the things you've done incredibly well is Hawk. And I have to think, I would imagine Hawk's a hard character to write, because for somebody who's not Black. Yeah. Simply because if and because people are sensitive more than ever.
Yeah.
And I even, going back to read your first book, and then going to read the new one, I can even see where you've evolved in terms of how you deal with Hawk. Sure. But also you've given Hawk an inner life that he did not really have with Parker. You have put meat on those bones in a way that I think has been fascinating.
I think I've known a lot of guys like Hawk over the years. My dad, most of his life worked in the NFL, and so from the time I was a young kid, I grew up around pro athletes and guys that had to work their butt off to get where they were, and had a lot of inner strength. They had a lot of confidence. They had a lot of style. They had a certain way of carrying themselves. And I think that and also through my own experiences of playing college football and having teammates. And so, that world of, being around very confident, strong, men of color is very normal for me, is very, I know guys like Hawk and the way that they have that inner confidence and that strength. And so I think if anything, probably going back to Lullaby, is, I lessen some of the obvious kind of jabs of jokes between Hawk and Spenser that I don't think you would have anymore. I don't think that that's something that's really going to be discussed among guys at this period of time. And in doing so, you kind of had a vacuum of filling in, like, who is Hawk? Just a little bit. We don't want to know too much about him.
He's still an
But
enigma. Yeah,
yeah, he's still, I don't really ever want a Hawk book. I hope nobody is ever tasked with the idea of writing a Hawk book, because that would destroy the character. When he leaves the stage, we don't know where he goes. But anyway, so yeah, for Hawk, is, I think he's still who he is, but I think that he, like Spenser, they're still live by the same code and the same sense of honor.
It's also interesting that it occurred to me reading the book that you've thrown out some possible plots for the future, both with Hawk and with Maddie Sullivan. Did you sort of set that up knowing that, well, somebody else is going to have to do this? Or are you a little disappointed you're not, there may be some threads you would have liked to have pulled on?
Well, I think there was really no way of ever writing this book and, like, sewing up 50 years of Spenser. You just, there's some callbacks. There's some characters, with Jerry Braz and his connection to Joe, and Joe is really a major figure in Lullaby, and that all goes back to Godwolf manuscript. And so there's a lot of kind of like 50th anniversary Easter eggs in the book. But I couldn't really wrap up everything, and that's not really what my job is. My job is just, so I really try to write this as if I really came to the idea that I'd be writing another one. Is my sense is, I just said, well, this is where I would end it. This is it. And if other writers want to take on those storylines, obviously that's their decision to make. Is it going to be a reboot? Is there the same story structure as any of the stories or characters that came about in the last 10 years going to carry on? It's not for me to decide. I have no idea. It may be a whole different vision. I'm not sure what will take place. I've had some conversations with Mike Lupica. Mike and I've been friends for a number of years, and he asked me recently about kind of the new structure of the Boston Police Department. So I think that he's going to keep somewhat of a semblance of what I had been doing, as far as, advancing those characters, but still keeping them, and then still keeping them where they're age-wise, they're still relevant.
Yeah. And I have to say, I think that you got Susan Silverman where Joan Parker would have wanted her. Because I talked to Joan after Robert B. Parker died, and I think before you started the books, and she was just, she'd had it with Susan Silverman in a lot of ways, and Susan was based on her. So I think based on just the conversations she and I had, I think you got Susan to where she wanted her to be.
Well, I think anytime that I write Susan, and I know people have had problems with Susan because they think she's a little bit clingy and annoying and that kind of thing. And Joan Parker was not any of those things. Joan Parker was very strong, very confident, exceptionally opinionated, would tell you exactly where you stood. And that was really, I think, what Susan was like in the early books, very early books, going back to when we first met her. Very strong, very opinionated, very, had a salty way of expressing herself, that kind of thing. So when I started writing Susan, I really tried to just base it on Joan completely and just do Joan Parker. I think that the character of Susan became softer and a little bit more clingy, a little bit more, a little bit more congratulatory towards Spenser as the years progressed. And of course, Joan may have told you the story. Is Joan asked Bob that one time, said, Bob, why do you have Susan doing this? Where Susan is grabbing Spenser and saying, you are the most brave man, that you're doing things that, have to be done. And I know this is who you are, and you have to be true to yourself. And she's like, where do you get this shit? And Bob would reply, he goes, well, that's the way that I would like you to be, So that gives you a little insight into the dynamic. But I think the earlier drawing of Susan I liked a lot better. That was much more closer to Joan initially. And Joan was a true wonderful person, very strong character, will be remembered years and years in Boston for being a great philanthropist and fundraiser, and did a lot of things to help less fortunate people. She was a hero herself. So anything that I write with Susan, Joan is still whispering in my ear.
And it's interesting when you talk about that. I can remember when I interviewed Parker, one of the things he said is one of the reason Dr. Watson exists in the Sherlock Holmes novels is to tell you how brilliant Holmes is, even when Holmes isn't doing something particularly brilliant.
Right.
Right. And that so that he said that, yeah, he just said Holmes isn't that smart, but because Watson keeps saying, "Oh, you're brilliant, Holmes," everybody says, "Oh, he must be brilliant." And so like maybe it's at some level he was employing that same trick to Susan.
Maybe. I think it was the elevated version of his idealized relationship of the way that the dynamics would work. But I tell you what, Joan deferred to no one. Joan was very independent. She was her own woman, and it all boiled down to that famous story about them having separate residences within the same house. That independence allowed them to really have a happy marriage and a happy life. So the independence of them is, I think, key to the very Parker-esque dynamic between Spenser and Susan.
Do you think it helped you not, because you'd never met Robert B. Parker?
I never met Bob.
We
corresponded. We traded letters for a few years. It was funny. There was one time I was supposed to go to a book signing in Atlanta, and I couldn't come because I was playing football at Auburn, and I couldn't really tell my coaches, "Hey, I got to go to a book signing." That would have gone I can't make practice. I got to go to a book signing. So I sent my mother, and my mother got me a copy of Double Deuce that was signed to me for my 22nd birthday, and It said, his nickname was Ace, right, as well, as you know, and it said "From one ace to another, Bob Parker." And so she had a nice conversation with Bob, and Bob was, of course, his normal, charismatic, wonderful self. But I think in some ways that's probably helped me. I got in, and I knew the people very, very well who were the closest to Bob, and they were very open with me about Bob, and very open about, what I think what made Spenser tick, particularly Joan and his friend Mel Farman, who is, as I mentioned, one of my dear friends, and they taught me a lot about Bob, and maybe things I don't think he would have shared with anybody. And so that was I couldn't have done it without him.
Yeah, and because there's no fan service in the negative sense of that in all your books, right? I mean, there's stuff is there, but it's to serve the story, not to just make the fans happy. Yeah,
I mean, it's not. I mean, every book has got This is every book I do for Spenser, or for is this a book that needs to be written if Spenser wasn't in it? And if this was a John Smith novel, would this be something that would be published and be something that people would enjoy reading? And that's what gets me into these books. And that's what hopefully I've delivered is, we have Spenser, we have Susan, we have this great cast, but without something great for them to do, then they're just walking and talking, and who cares, But if it's a big event and it's something that's, again, a story that we could tell without Spenser being in it, you marry those two things. I think it was a really good story, a really good thriller, and those great characters, and then hopefully you really have something.
So in the past when we've talked, we've often talked about bourbon, which is, I know, one of your passions. But I have a different alcohol question for you this time. Right. So martinis, gin or vodka? Now, before you commit yourself, here's the reason I'm asking. So in Bye Bye Baby, there's a point where Spenser expounds on why vodka martinis are not really martinis.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And yet, chapter 3 of Lullaby, he orders a Grey Goose martini.
It's true.
What happened?
Well, I think it was evolution of the author, the evolution of the storytelling. Now, I'll be honest with you. I like a vodka martini better. I really do. But being in the context of Spenser as a very classic American character that goes back to, Nick Charles and back to Philip Marlowe and that kind of thing, they would not be at all ever, vodka is a Russian drink. They're not touching this stuff. So but there's definitely an inconsistency in what he is drinking. But the other night I had a martini, and I have to admit, I was drinking vodka, but I do like a good gin martini. The one thing, there's a wonderful guy here where I live in Oxford, Mississippi. His name is Joe Stitchcomb, and Joe is one of the best known bartenders, mixologists. He writes pieces for Garden and Gun magazine, and he's very well known. Goes over, and he has really gotten me over my fear of vermouth. And that's something that I always heard my whole life is vermouth is bad. Just whisper it over the glass. Don't touch it, whatever. And Joe, this excellent guy, he goes, those Italian people, they knew what they're doing. They make some great stuff. Don't be afraid of vermouth. And so I've been really making, I guess, a true martini with vermouth lately. And opened up the idea to gin. But yes, yeah, the drink change is definitely that is there. You nailed me on that one. That is true.
Well, Fear of Vermouth sounds like a pretty good title for a book, actually. All right, last question. Quinn Colson, love those books as well. When can we expect the next Quinn Colson book?
Well, I've been asked about this lately because usually, following on the heels of the new Spenser, then I start talking about the next Quinn Colson, but I'm giving myself a little bit of a rest. I've been on a 2-book-a-year schedule for a decade now. And I kind of like taking a little bit of a break. Also, these are weird times. I don't need to tell anybody that. I don't know what Quinn would be doing during the pandemic. I'm not sure if that anyone really wants to write a pandemic centered book, set in the rural South. I think there's a lot of really hard stuff that's been going on these last couple of years. As Quinn's wife works in the medical center in Mississippi, and Quinn's dealing with stuff out in the county, and knowing my friends that work in law enforcement around here, it's not been an easy time. So I think when I'm working on a different project right now. I'm not working on a Quinn book. I'm letting Quinn rest for a little bit. But when I go back to it, I don't think anything's going to be related to be hopefully around pandemic times. Hopefully this is something that's going to be happening. I don't want to say post-pandemic because we don't know when that's going to be, but something that'll happen a few years since the last events from the Heathens, which was the 11th book, or it might be something that goes back in Quinn's past, even before the Ranger. And so I'm playing around with a few different of those, few different ideas. But he will return, as they used to say with James Bond. James Bond always says he will return, and he will return in some capacity, hopefully with a world in a better place.
Well, whatever the next project is, I hope you'll come back and talk about it here, or
Always.
Maybe actually, if you get to do an actual real book tour, that we can have a gin, vodka, martini, beer, whatever.
I think we'll just line them up. We'll do a taste test. We'll do the vodka and we'll do the gin, and we'll stumble out of there hopefully with some kind of answer.
Sounds like a deal. Listen, take care. Good luck with the new book. And,
thanks, Kevin.
And I look forward to talking to you again soon.
I appreciate it. And thanks for 10 years of support for this series. I really do appreciate it.
Not done yet. Take care.